Hey guys, and thanks for tuning in. Tonight we talk about the little known facts of Queen Victoria I, a queen so influential that her name still defines an entire era, the Victorian Age. And yet, behind the portraits and the history books, her story is filled with secrets, contradictions, and surprising quirks. We also dive into the notable inventions founded during the Victorian era and what daily life looked like during the Victorian era for both the poor and the rich. But before we begin, please consider giving this video a like and subscribe if you enjoy my content. And without further ado, let's get started. Imagine a woman who ruled over a quarter of the world's population, yet started her life as a sheltered princess who wasn't even supposed to inherit the throne. Queen Victoria I wasn't just a stern matriarch draped in black mourning clothes. She was a passionate letter writer, a lover of the arts, and an unexpected polyglot, and believe it or not, a thrill seeker with a taste for the unusual. She witnessed the dawn of photography, the invention of the telephone, and the expansion of the British Empire to its zenith, all while managing a turbulent personal life that would put today's royal dramas to shame. From her unexpected ascension to the throne at just 18, to her fiery temper, unusual friendships, and even the peculiar food obsessions she kept behind palace doors, Victoria's life is a treasure trove of little-known details that reveal a queen far more human, witty, and complicated than the history books let on. So before we step into the gaslit streets and glittering ballrooms of the Victorian era, let's pull back the velvet curtain and uncover the surprising, strange, and fascinating truths about the woman who reigned for over 6 decades and became one of the most powerful figures in history. Victoria's childhood was anything but normal, and not in the charming fairy tale way you might expect. Born in 1819, she was raised under something called the Kensington system, a strict set of rules devised by her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her ambitious advisor, Sir John Conroy. The goal? Keep young Victoria isolated, dependent, and completely under her control. She wasn't allowed to walk downstairs without holding someone's hand first. She couldn't sleep in a room alone. And perhaps strangest of all, she was rarely permitted to spend time with children her own age. The result? Little Victoria created an entire world of companionship out of dolls. And we're not talking about a few treasured toys over here. She had over 130 handmade dolls, each dressed in elaborate outfits that represented real people that she'd read about or heard of. Foreign dignitaries, theater performers, even people she'd seen from a distance on carriage rides, all found their way into her doll collection. She'd carefully note their names and personalities in tiny journals, as if building her own miniature society to make up for the one that she wasn't allowed to join. But her isolation didn't just lead to doll making. It gave her an unshakable stubbornness. Even as a child, she knew that one day she was going to be queen, and she developed an early habit of defiance. When she was told that she must always hold her mother's hand when walking down the palace staircase, she reportedly dug in her heels and refused to move, a royal standoff in miniature. And perhaps the most curious twist of all, despite this strange, lonely upbringing, Victoria grew into a queen who would become famous for her strong opinions, passionate emotions, and surprisingly, a love for the drama of human interaction she was once denied. As she grew older, the isolation only sharpened her stubborn streak. At 13, she was finally shown a genealogical chart, proving she was next in line to the throne. Her reaction? A firm, almost theatrical declaration. I will be good. Yet privately, she was already beginning to push back. She refused to appoint Sir John Conroy to any position of power once she became queen, a personal vendetta in the years making. And then, at just 18, she inherited the crown. Her first act as monarch? Move into Buckingham Palace. Alone. For the first time in her life, she had a bedroom to herself. She also banned her mother from sleeping in the same quarters. A quiet, but unmistakable act of rebellion against years of control. But some quirks from her childhood never left her. She remained an obsessive note-taker, filling journals with observations about every single person she met. She adored pets, dogs, horses, even goats, and gave them titles as if they were courtiers. And in an odd echo of her doll collecting days, she had a fascination with documenting people's appearances in minute detail, sometimes sketching strangers she saw on carriage rides. From lonely little girl to the most powerful woman in the world, Victoria carried the imprint of her strange upbringing into every corner of her reign. And it's in these quirks, the dolls, the stubbornness, and the meticulous record-keeping that the real woman behind the crown begins to peek through. By the time Victoria was 20, she had settled into her role as queen, independent, determined, and in no hurry to give up control. But there was one matter she couldn't avoid forever: marriage. Enter Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, her tall, serious, and exceptionally well-groomed cousin from Germany. The two had first met as teenagers, and although Victoria had found him handsome then, she wasn't ready for the idea of marriage. But when Albert returned to England in 1839, something shifted. She found herself enchanted, not only by his looks, but by his quiet steadiness, the perfect balance to her fiery nature. Here's the twist. As queen, Victoria had to be the one to propose. And she did. On October 15th, 1839, in a moment she later described in her diary as quite in love, she wrote, "It was the happiest, brightest moment of my life." Albert accepted, and preparations for a royal wedding began. Preparations that would end up changing wedding tradition for generations. At the time, royal brides often wore elaborate silver or gold dresses, dripping with jewels. But Victoria chose something entirely different: a gown of pure white satin, trimmed with lace. She wanted to support the British industry by showcasing English lace, but she also liked the simplicity of the look, a deliberate contrast to the usual royal opulence. The effect was stunning. Newspapers gushed, and before long, brides across Britain and eventually the Western world were wearing white in imitation of the young queen. Without realizing it, Victoria had created the white wedding trend that we still follow today. Her wedding day, February 10th, 1840, was a lavish affair, but it was also deeply personal. Victoria insisted on walking down the aisle without a crown, wearing instead a simple wreath of orange blossoms, a symbol of purity and fertility. And in a small but telling detail, she had 12 bridesmaids, all dressed in white, forming the ethereal image that would become the gold standard for Victorian wedding fashion. Married life with Albert was, at least at first, everything she had hoped for. They shared a deep intellectual connection, a mutual love of music and art, and a devotion that saw them through political storms. Yet their marriage, it was also fiery. Victoria, well, she could be domineering, Albert, stubborn. But for all their quarrels, she relied on him deeply, calling him her angel and her strength. It was a love story that began with a queen breaking tradition by proposing, and went on to shape traditions the rest of the world still follows nearly 2 centuries later. Married life with Albert began like something from a romantic novel, but it quickly turned into a saga of duty, control, and more than a little frustration. Victoria and Albert had 9 children over 17 years, each one given a princely or princessly role in the intricate marriage politics of Europe. Yet for all those babies in the nursery, Victoria was never what you'd call a naturally maternal woman. She openly admitted that she disliked pregnancy, finding it really uncomfortable and undignified. And she once referred to newborns as frog-like in their appearance. While she was fiercely protective of her children, she also kept a certain emotional distance, often preferring the company of Albert or her ministers to noise out the nursery. Albert, by contrast, adored the role of father and took an active interest in the children's education. This imbalance sometimes made Victoria bristle. She was the queen, after all, and didn't like anyone, even her husband, seeming to have more influence. She insisted on having the final say in almost everything that affected her children's lives. In fact, her need for control went further than most parents would dare. Victoria had her children quietly spied on by trusted attendants, reporting back to her on their conversations, their moods, and even potential romances. Nothing escaped her notice, from minor acts of disobedience to whispered crushes. She used this intelligence to steer their futures, arranging marriages that would strengthen Britain's political ties across Europe, sometimes against the children's wishes. It made for a tense family dynamic. Several of her children grew up feeling stifled, and more than one clashed openly with her over the life partners she had chosen for them. Yet Victoria saw herself as simply doing her duty as both queen and mother, a duty that, in her eyes, justified even the most intrusive measures. Still, for all of her disputes, Albert remained her anchor. He managed to soothe her tempers, balance her stubbornness, and persuade her, well, at least occasionally, to loosen her grip. But the peace he kept was fragile, and in 1861 it shattered. Albert died suddenly, at the age of 42, and Victoria's life, well, it would never be the same. Albert's death in December of 1861 struck Victoria like a physical blow. He had been her partner, her confidant, the one person who could temper her fierce will, and now he was gone. The cause was likely typhoid fever, though Victoria always believed that overwork had hastened his death. From that moment on, she entered a state of mourning, so deep and so enduring that it became part of her very identity. She dressed in black from head to toe for the remaining 40 years of her life, a constant visual reminder to the world of her grief. But her mourning wasn't just public. It was woven into the daily rituals of her private life. In Albert's rooms, nothing was touched. His clothes were laid out each day as if he might walk in at any moment. Fresh water was placed in his basin, and his shaving brush was set beside it. Even his pocket watch was wound each morning. These were not symbolic gestures to her. They were acts of devotion, ways to keep him present in a life that now felt unbearably empty. Her withdrawal from public life was so complete that newspapers began to question whether she intended to rule at all. She avoided state ceremonies, rarely appeared in London, and spent long stretches of time at Balmoral in Scotland, her Osborne house in the Isle of Wight. It was at Balmoral that she formed deep, and to many suspicious, friendship with a rugged Highland servant named John Brown. Brown was blunt, physically strong, and unafraid to speak to the Queen as if she were just an ordinary woman. It is believed that these qualities were found oddly comforting by the Queen. He escorted her on horseback rides, accompanied her on walks, and to the horror of the court, was often seen in her private apartments without ceremony. Rumors spread quickly. Political cartoons mocked her as Mrs. Brown, and whispers of a secret marriage circled through London society. Victoria never publicly addressed the gossip, but her devotion to Brown, it was plain. She gave him gifts, commissioned a portrait of him, and after his death, had a statue made in his honor, an act that only fueled speculation. This period marked a turning point in her reign. The queen had transformed from a young, passionate monarch into a reclusive figure shrouded in black, clinging to rituals and relationships that baffled her minister and scandalized her subjects. But behind the black veil, Victoria was far from done making history. Her personal attachments would continue to shape the monarchy for decades to come. As the years passed, Victoria slowly re-emerged from her seclusion, though she never shed the black mourning clothes that had become her trademark. She was now a grandmother, not just to her own sprawling family, but to much of Europe's royalty. Her matchmaking had been so extensive that she earned the nickname the Grandmother of Europe. Though, as ever, she preferred to keep her grandchildren firmly under her watchful eye. In later years, she developed a fascination with India, a jewel of her empire she had never visited in person. At Osborne House, she surrounded herself with Indian servants, art, and textiles. One servant in particular, Abdul Karim, a young clerk from Agra, became her favorite. She called him her teacher and took lessons in Hindi from him, astonishing courtiers by writing and speaking the language with genuine enthusiasm. She showered him with gifts, elevated his position, and defended him fiercely against the prejudice of her household. The friendship scandalized her family and government, much as John Brown's had, but Victoria, she ignored their protests. She valued loyalty and she valued companionship, no matter how unconventional it looked to others. Even in her 80s, Victoria remained opinionated and engaged. She loved being weighed at Balmoral, devoured curries alongside roast beef, and filled her journals with sharp, unfiltered observations. But age, it was catching up with her, and in her private letters, she began to speak of death with surprising practicality. When she died in January of 1901, after a reign of 63 years, her funeral arrangements revealed one last layer of eccentricity. Victoria had left precise instructions. She was to be buried in white, not black, and with a collection of sentimental objects hidden in her coffin. Among them were Albert's dressing gown, a plaster cast of his hand, photographs of her children, a lock of John Brown's hair, and a ring he had once given her. It was a final, quiet rebellion against the sanitized image of a life that the public preferred to believe. And so, the woman who began as a lonely little princess in Kensington Palace left the world as one of history's most formidable queens. A ruler shaped by love, loss, and 1,000 peculiar details that made her as human as she was iconic. Victoria's death in 1901 closed the curtain on more than just a remarkable life. It marked the end of an era that had reshaped Britain and much of the world. Because while her personal story is filled with eccentricities, romances, and private dramas, the age that bears her name, the Victorian era, was about far more than the woman on the throne. It was a time of dizzying change. Over her 63 years as queen, Britain transformed from a largely rural, house-drawn society and into an industrial powerhouse of steam engines, telegraphs, and railways. Scientific discoveries, social reforms, and cultural revolutions rippled through everyday life, touching everything from how people worked and traveled to how they dressed, learned, and thought about morality. In other words, Victoria didn't just rule over her people. She reigned over a world in the middle of reinvention. And to understand the true impact of her reign, we have to take a step out of the royal palace and into the streets, factories, and drawing rooms of the 19th century, where the Victorian age was quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, rewriting the rules of society. The Victorian era was a paradox, a time of strict manners and moral codes, but also of relentless curiosity and groundbreaking change. Walk down a London street in the 1830s, and you'd find soot-covered brick buildings, rattling carriages, and narrow alleys packed with market stalls. Walk that same street in the 1890s, and you might see electric streetlights, department stores, glittering with goods, and the distant hum of a train bound for somewhere that once felt impossibly far away. One of the biggest transformations was industrial progress. Steam engines powered trains that could cross the country in hours rather than days. Factories produced textiles, iron, and consumer goods on a scale never seen before. This industrial boom fueled cities to grow at a staggering pace, but it also meant overcrowded slums, pollution, and grueling working conditions for the poor. Alongside industry came scientific leaps. Theories of evolution from Charles Darwin challenged old beliefs. Florence Nightingale revolutionized nursing, and Joseph Lister's work on antiseptics began to make surgery way less deadly. The Victorians embraced inventions like photography, the telegraph, and even early typewriters, shrinking the world both visually and in communication. Society itself was shifting. A growing middle class began to enjoy luxuries once reserved for the wealthy. Fine furniture, fashionable clothes, and even seaside holidays. Education expanded too. By the end of Victoria's reign, school was compulsory for children in Britain, a radical idea just decades earlier. Literacy rates climbed, and with them came a hunger for newspapers, novels, and serialized stories that could grip the public's imagination. But the era also had a tight grip on morality, or at least the appearance of it. The Victorians were famous for their strict codes of conduct, emphasizing propriety, respectability, and modesty. Public behavior, it mattered, but behind closed doors, life could be far less restrained, a contrast that has fueled fascination with the period ever since. Even fashion told the story of change. The wide crinolines and corsets of the early reign gave way to sleeker silhouettes as the century closed. Men's attire shifted towards the sober suits we still recognize today. And of course, weddings around the world continued to follow the white dress tradition Victoria herself had set in motion. By the dawn of the 20th century, Britain had become the most powerful empire in the world, its culture and inventions touching lives far beyond its shores. Yet the Victorian Age was never just about progress or empire. It was about a society learning, for better or for worse, on how to live in a modern world. But sweeping change isn't just written in grand events and inventions. It's etched into the rhythm of daily life. And in Victorian Britain, perhaps no one felt the transformation more keenly than the new middle class. They were the shopkeepers, the clerks, the factory managers, and the small business owners whose fortunes had risen alongside the country's industrial might. For centuries, society had been divided sharply between the wealthy aristocracy and the struggling poor. But now, a swelling middle tier emerged, neither titled nor astute, but hungry for comfort, respectability, and a slice of the prosperity that suddenly seemed within reach. Their homes were modest compared to the grand estates of the nobility, yet filled with little luxuries their parents could never have dreamed of. Patterned china, upholstered chairs, polished clocks on the mantel. With new train lines came the possibility of weekend trips to the seaside, a novelty that became almost a rite of passage for a respectable family. Gas lamps glowed in drawing rooms, newspapers were delivered to the door, and store windows displayed goods from across the empire, tea from India, sugar from the Caribbean, and fine fabrics from every corner of the globe. And yet, middle-class life wasn't only about new possessions. It was about identity. Respectability was the watchword, and with it came rules, endless, intricate rules about manners, conversation, dress, and even how one displayed their furniture. A spotless front room wasn't just for comfort. It was a stage for showing neighbors and visitors that you might be moving up in the world. This new middle class was building something unprecedented, a life defined not by ancient titles or land ownership, but by hard work, ambition, and the subtle art of keeping up appearances. And if you step through the polished front doors of a respectable Victorian home, you'd find a world carefully arranged to balance tradition with modern convenience, a world that tells us as much about the 19th century as any royal decree or great invention. So let's step inside and see what daily life really looked like for this rising class. Step through the front door of a respectable Victorian middle-class home, and the first thing you'll notice is the smell. A faint blend of coal smoke from the fireplace, beeswax from polished furniture, and maybe the lingering scent of last night's roast beef dinner. We're in the parlor, the pride of the household. Everything here is arranged to impress guests. The family's best china, displayed in a glass front cabinet, lace doilies protecting every polished surface, heavy drapes framing the windows to keep out both drafts and prying eyes. On the mantel, a clock ticks steadily beside framed photographs, a relatively new luxury, proof that the family has kept pace with modern fashions. This is not a room for lounging. It's a showroom for status. Through a doorway, we enter the dining room, where the family gathers for the main meal of the day. The table is laid with patent plates, silver-plated cutlery, and a starched white cloth. The menu might be simple, perhaps mutton with potatoes and seasoned vegetables, but it's served with ceremony, for meals are much about propriety as they are about nourishment. Upstairs, the bedrooms tell quieter stories. The master bedroom is practical but tidy, with a cast iron bedstead, a wardrobe for the lady's growing collection of dresses, and a washstand with a porcelain basin for the morning routine. The children's room is a little bit more cramped, often shared by siblings, with toys carefully stored away when not in use, a reminder that tidiness was a moral virtue in the Victorian home. Downstairs again and into the kitchen, the true heart of daily life. Here, a black iron range is always warm, fueled by coal, and the air smells faintly of bread baking or soup simmering. This is the domain of the servant, or, if the family cannot afford a live-in help, the housewife herself. Brass pots gleam on hooks, and every surface bears the marks of constant use. Beyond the back door lies the scullery, where water is drawn from a tap or a pump. Clothes are scrubbed by hand, and dishes are washed in a deep sink. In smaller homes, this space might also serve as the laundry, with damp clothes hung to dry near a warmth of the kitchen fire. Evenings are spent back in the parlor or sitting room, perhaps reading aloud from a novel by Dickens or listening to the father play a tune on the piano, if the family is musically inclined, of course. Gas lights or oil lamps throw a warm glow, and the outside world, noisy, smoky, and bustling, it feels far away. Life here is comfortable and carefully managed, with every room, every habit, and every object reflecting the Victorian middle class's central pursuit, respectability. And in this pursuit, the home wasn't just a place to live. It was a statement to the world. Cleanliness in the Victorian middle-class home wasn't just a preference. It was a moral duty. A tidy, well-kept household was seen as a reflection of character, discipline, and social standing. And while much of that work still fell to human hands, whether it was the housewife or the servants, the 19th century brought a wave of new inventions that made keeping up appearances just a little bit easier. Take the flushing toilet, for example. Early in the century, most homes still relied on chamber pots and outhouses, but improvements in plumbing brought water closets into more and more middle-class houses by the 1880s. No longer was waste disposal an outdoor trek in the middle of the night. Now, a discreet pull chain could carry it away with the rush of water. For families that could afford it, this was not only a convenience, but a status symbol, a mark that they were keeping up with the latest in sanitary science. Then there was the mechanical carpet sweeper, patented by Melville Bissell in 1876. Before this, cleaning carpets meant hauling them outside and beating the dust out, an exhausting, messy job. The carpet sweeper allowed a servant or housewife to run a lightweight device across the floor, gathering dust and crumbs in minutes without lifting a rug from its place. By the turn of the century, early vacuum cleaners, large, awkward contraptions powered by hand pumps or small motors, were beginning to appear in most modern homes, turning what had once been a seasonal ordeal into a weekly routine. In the kitchen, coal-fired ranges replaced open hearths, providing steady heat for cooking and baking, while also reducing the soot and ash that used to coat every surface. This meant cleaner walls, cleaner cookware, and fewer days spent scrubbing stubborn black stains. Some homes even had early gas stoves, which were easier to control and kept the air clearer, a small miracle for any servant tasked with cooking multiple meals a day. Water supply improvements were just as important as mechanical innovations. Indoor running water became increasingly common in middle-class homes, allowing for regular washing of clothes, dishes, and hands without hauling buckets from an outdoor pump. In the scullery, deep porcelain sinks made dishwashing more sanitary, while the newer popular ringing washing machines, hand-cranked but surprisingly effective, took hours off the back-breaking chore of laundry day. Lighting also played its part. The shift from candles and oil lamps to gaslight, and eventually to electric bulbs in the very last years of Victoria's reign, meant fewer soot stains on walls and ceilings, fewer wax strips on tablecloths, and a brighter, more cheerful interior. And of course, there were the quieter, less glamorous helpers, feather dusters, metal polish, scrubbing brushes with interchangeable heads, and early disinfectants like carbolic acid, a product of the same germ theory revolution that transformed hospitals. Together, they armed the Victorian housekeeper with an arsenal of tools to keep every surface gleaming. For the middle class, these inventions weren't just conveniences. They were symbols of progress, proof that their homes, like their ambitions, were moving with the times. A spotless carpet, a shining brass kettle, and the discreet hum of modern plumbing told visitors that this was not merely a household. It was a well-run little kingdom. Step into a Victorian working-class home, and the differences from the middle-class townhouse, well, they're immediate. Space is tight, the air warmer and more crowded. The walls are bare or papered with inexpensive prints, the floors often uncovered boards or worn rugs. Yet even here, the 19th century's wave of invention found its way inside, though often in simpler, secondhand, or improvised forms. The flushing toilet, for example, was rarely a private indoor convenience in working-class neighborhoods. More often, it was a shared facility at the end of the street or in the back court, serving multiple families. Still, this was an improvement over the old night soil buckets and open cesspits that had plagued cities for centuries. Public health reforms gradually brought better sewage systems to poorer districts, meaning cleaner streets and fewer outbreaks of deadly diseases like cholera. Carpets were a rarity here, so the carpet sweeper was replaced by the humble broom and earth brush. Dust was constant, especially in industrial towns where soot settled on windowsills and tabletops within hours. Many households kept a rag or duster within arm's reach at all times, ready to swipe away the black film that drifted in from nearby factories or chimneys. Cooking was still done on a coal range, or even an open fire in the smallest of homes. The range might be secondhand, worn, and temperamental, but it still provided warmth and a place to boil the ever-present kettle. Without gas or electricity, light came from candles or oil lamps, which left their own layer of soot, another chore to scrub away at the end of the week. Running water, if available, was usually found at a communal pump or standpipe outside. Laundry days meant hauling heavy pails indoors, heating the water on the stove, and scrubbing clothes in a tin wash tub with a bar of coarse soap. The wringer, that hand-cranked device that squeezed water from clothes, was a luxury, but when a family could afford to borrow one, it saved hours of work and spared many aching wrists. Even the smallest homes embraced simple cleaning aids, scrubbing brushes, whitewash for brightening dingy walls, and homemade disinfectants made with vinegar or carbolic soap. Some enterprising women often took in washing or mending for wealthier families, turning their hard-won housekeeping skills into a small income. For working-class Victorians, cleanliness wasn't about impressing dinner guests or showing off the latest gadget. It was about dignity. Keeping the front steps scrubbed, the windows clear, and the earth swept was a way of pushing back against the grime of city life. Proof that even in the shadow of factories and crowded streets, a home could still be a place of order and pride. Side by side, the differences between a Victorian middle-class home and a working-class dwelling are striking. In the townhouse, inventions like the flushing toilet, the carpet sweeper, and the coal range were signs of progress, conveniences that made life cleaner, easier, and more refined. In the cramped terrace or tenement, those same technologies, if they appeared at all, were shared, secondhand, or pared down to their simplest form. Yet in both homes, the pursuit of cleanliness was more than just a chore. It was a statement. For the middle class, a spotless parlor and gleaming silverware declared respectability and upward ambition. For the working class, a scrubbed doorstep and tidy earth asserted dignity in the face of hardship. Both households wrestled with coal dust that clung to every surface, laundry that demanded hours of labor, and the ever-present battle against the city's dirt and smell. Both relied on small innovations, whether a mechanical carpet sweeper or a stiff bristled brush, to keep that battle winnable. In the end, the differences lay not so much in the desire for order, but in the resources available to achieve it. The Victorian era may have been an age of invention, but how those inventions touched daily life depended entirely on where you stood in the social ladder. And it wasn't just the home that revealed this divide. The streets, the workplaces, even leisure time told a different story. To really understand Victorian society, we have to step outside the front door and see how the world looked when these two very different classes crossed paths in public. Step outside a Victorian home, whether the polished townhouse in the middle class or the cramped terrace of the working class, and the air, it changes immediately. The faint smell of coal smoke that lingered indoors becomes a sharp, smoky haze outdoors, mingled with the scent of horse manure, fresh bread from the bakers, and the tang of the nearby river or canal. The streets themselves are alive with movement. Horse-drawn omnibuses rumble past, carrying middle-class clerks to their offices and shopkeepers to their stores. Market carts creak along, piled high with vegetables, fish, or coal for delivery. Costermongers, street sellers, call out their wares, their voices carrying over the rattle of carriage wheels on cobblestones. For the middle class, the streets are a place to be seen as much as a place to go. A gentleman tips his hat as he passes acquaintances. A lady in a fitted walking dress lifts her skirts just enough to avoid the worst of the mud, careful to keep her gloves spotless. They move between tidy shop fronts, banks, and post offices, perhaps stopping for tea in one of the growing number of respectable cafes. If they need to travel further, a cab or a train carriage awaits, paid for with ease. For the working class, the streets are part of workplace, part thoroughfare, and sometimes part refuge. Laborers walk to the docks, factories, or building sites, lunch pails in hand. Women hurry to the market early, hoping to get food before the best cuts are gone. Children dart between wagons, carrying messages or helping with errands, their hands and faces often smudged from the day's work. In poorer districts, the street itself can be an extension of the home, laundry lines strung between buildings, neighbors gossiping on doorsteps, and children playing games chalked into the pavement. Leisure time shows the divide even more clearly. Middle-class families might stroll in well-kept public parks, themselves a Victorian innovation, or take day trips to the seaside, traveling by train. They attend lectures, concerts, and exhibitions, all carefully chosen to match the era's sense of refinement. The working class might find entertainment in the music hall, with its rowdy songs and comic acts, or spend a precious free afternoon watching a street performance, visiting a fairground, or cheering on a local sporting match. But no matter the class, the streets of Victorian Britain are a constant meeting ground. Here, factory girls brush past society ladies, errand boys weave between horse-drawn cabs, beggars call out to passing businessmen. The city is a patchwork of lives, fortunes, and ambitions, all moving through the same crowded streets, yet rarely crossing into one another's world. If the streets of Victorian Britain were bustling, the country's new transport networks made them feel like the center of an ever-expanding web. For the first time in history, ordinary people, not just the wealthy, could travel far beyond their own neighborhoods, towns, and even countries, thanks to the revolution in transportation. The beating heart of this change was the railway. When Victoria came to the throne in 1837, Britain's rail system was still in its infancy. By the end of her reign, steel tracks crisscrossed the nation, linking cities, ports, and countryside in a vast network. What once took days by carriage could now be done in hours, and at a price many middle-class families and even some working-class ones could actually afford. Railway transformed everyday life. The seaside holiday became a national pastime, with towns like Brighton and Blackpool swelling each summer with visitors clutching picnic baskets and parasols. Fresh fish could be shipped inland overnight, and newspapers printed in London could be read in distant towns the very next morning. For clerks, merchants, and traveling salesmen, the train was not just a convenience, it was an opportunity. In the cities, horse-drawn omnibuses trundled along fixed routes, offering shared rides at set fares. They were slower than trains, but they brought a new order to urban travel. No more haggling with cab drivers or walking miles across town. By the 1890s, these were joined by electric trams, quieter, cleaner, and faster than their horse-drawn predecessors, gliding through the streets on shining rails. For the more independent traveler, there was the bicycle. In the 1880s and 1890s, the safety bicycle, with 2 equal-sized wheels and a chain drive, became wildly popular, especially among the middle class. For women, it was more than just a means of transport. It was a symbol of freedom, allowing them to travel without relying on a male escort, and even inspiring changes in women's clothing to allow for easier riding. And for those with both money and ambition, ocean liners opened the world. Great steamships like the RMS Campania could cross the Atlantic in a week, carrying immigrants in steerage and wealthy passengers in staterooms with electric lights and hot running water. Empire and industry meant that ports buzzed with ships bound for India, Australia, Africa, and the Americas, carrying goods, news, and people in an endless tide. Travel in the Victorian Age was much more than just movement. It was a reshaping of time and distance. The world felt smaller, more connected. For a shopkeeper's daughter in Manchester or a clerk in London, the idea of seeing the sea, visiting another city, or even immigrating on board was no longer just a fantasy. You guys, it was just a ticket away. With new ways to travel and a growing sense of connection to the wider world, Victorians also began to rethink how they spent their free time. Leisure was no longer the sole domain of the aristocracy. It trickled down into the middle and even working classes, reshaping weekends, holidays, and evenings across the country. For the middle class, leisure often meant respectability and self-improvement, public museums, libraries, and art galleries. Many of them built during Victoria's reign became popular destinations, offering education and refinement at little or no cost. Theaters staged Shakespeare along new works by playwrights like Oscar Wilde, while the concert hall brought both classical music and latest popular songs to attentive audiences. But the railways had made another kind of leisure possible, the seaside holiday. Resorts like Brighton and Blackpool became summer playgrounds, complete with piers, bathing machines, and donkey rides in the sand. Families promenaded along the waterfront in their best clothes, eating ices and listening to brass bands, while the smell of salt water mingled with the distant scent of fried fish. For the working class, leisure often had a louder, livelier edge. The music hall was king, a place of comic songs, variety acts, acrobats, and dancers, where the audience would drink, laugh, and sing along without worrying about etiquette. In industrial towns, football clubs began to emerge, drawing passionate local crowds. Street fairs and circuses brought color to otherwise gray cityscapes, while penny gaff theaters and a traveling showman entertained those who couldn't afford a music hall ticket. Even in the home, leisure was changing. Affordable books, newspapers, and serialized novels kept readers hooked week after week. The spread of gaslight and later electricity made evenings longer, allowing for parlor games, sewing circles, or simply the luxury of reading after dark. Whether in the genteel hush of a gallery or the cheer of a football match, Victorians were discovering something new. The idea that life was not only about work and duty, but about enjoyment, shared experiences, and moments of escape from the daily grind. From the guarded childhood of a lonely princess to her unprecedented reign over a nation in transformation, Queen Victoria's story is deeply entwined with the era that bears her name. The Victorian era wasn't just a period of history. It was a time when the world itself seemed to quicken. Inventions changed how people lived at home, from flushing toilets to the first vacuum cleaners, a rising middle class embraced cleanliness as a badge of respectability, while working class families fought for dignity in the face of urban grime. Streets became the meeting ground of these worlds, each person moving to the rhythms of work, shopping, and basic life. Railways and steamships shrank the globe, while bicycles and trams gave individuals a newfound sense of freedom. And as travel and wages expanded, so too did leisure, from seaside promenades to rowdy music halls. It was an age of contrasts, progress and poverty, refinement and rough edges, strict morals and quiet rebellions. And at the center of it all was a small, determined woman in black, ruling for over 6 decades, shaping a nation and lending her name to an era that would redefine what it meant to live in the modern world. The Victorians left us more than monuments and museums. They left us the blueprint for much of the life that we know today. And perhaps that's why, even more than a century after her death, we still find ourselves fascinated by the Queen and the age she ruled. That's it for this video, you guys. If you made it this far, please comment on the Victorian era invention that you still find useful today. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. And if you're still awake, I'll tend to the fire a little bit longer, hoping that the embers will put you to sleep. Good night, you guys. See you in the morning.